Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this book discussion, part of ICG's online programs, webinars. We have with us Thomas Manuel with his first book, Opium Inc., due to be published shortly. This is Thomas's first book, but he has been a writer for a while. He has written for the Lapham's Quarterly, Nib, The Wire, The Hindu, among other publications. And in fact, in 2016, he won the Hindu Playwright Award for his play Hamlet and Angad. In 2020, the International Center Goa selected him for the inaugural Scholars in Residence Award. And we'll shortly be again getting down to selecting the second awardee for the International Center Goa's Scholars in Residence Award. Thomas currently works at India Inc., which is a public history project where he makes videos about how the past continues to affect us today. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Kitab, Books and Discussion of the International Center Goa. And I'm especially happy that you were able to actually come to Goa during this difficult period.
Yeah, like Goa is a great place to work. The International Center is a great place to be, and I'm honored to be the first scholar in residence here, and I hope that the program expands and grows. Yeah.
Okay, we will have a bunch of questions for Thomas, but just to tell everyone who's joined us that the program will be approximately 40 to 50 minutes. We'll also take select questions from those who are tuned in, and we'll try to end ideally at about 45 minutes. Thomas, this is a first book. So my first question is the very obvious kind. What really motivated you to write this book?
So this book comes out of an article I wrote in May 2019, which came out in the Hindu Sunday magazine, which was about Jamsetji Boy, the Parsi trader. And that article is about how, he was an opium trader and he became fabulously wealthy and, contributed so much to the landscape of Bombay, the physical kind of landscape of Bombay. And nobody seemed to know that. Nobody seemed to know this aspect of his life. And this is where he kind of got his money from. That article did really well. It really resonated with people. Sunday magazine got a lot of great feedback from that. And that success kind of showed me that, this is something that was worth expanding into a full book. Yeah.
So it really is true, that books begin with the smallest of ideas. A small piece that you publish somewhere eventually ends up as a book. Now, where does this book fit in with other books on colonialism and empire? I mean, we have had some immensely popular books on colonialism, on British colonialism, including Shashi Tharoor's book, which have done really well. We are all hoping, I'm hoping also for the center, that this book, which has a catchy title, a very catchy first line, which I'll talk about later. But the question really is on where does this book fit in with other books on popular history books on colonialism and empire?
See, obviously that's a very broad topic. Even within the opium trade, there are lots of great books. There's a lot of academic work on opium. Rolf Bauer, Karl Trocki, they've written great books about it. There's a lot of writing about the Opium Wars, specifically the two wars. I think that's a very, that has got the popular history treatment a couple of times. And, but the India side of the story is something that isn't focused on. Usually when people talk about the opium trade, they're talking about Britain and they're talking about China. Specifically the Qing Empire, but the version of the story where we are focusing on, the million plus people in India who are actually growing it, the kind of infrastructure that enable that, that side isn't discussed a lot. Amitav Ghosh, his trilogy of novels is probably the only really popular version of this moment in history that people have access to, and I know a lot of people have read it. And this book is sort of the aims to be as readable and is kind of like a non-fiction companion to the same things that inspired that trilogy.
So the book is due to be published within the next month. I'm one of the lucky few, I guess, who got to read some of it. but all the best with the book. Let's now get back to this book. Now, the one-line description you have for the book is provocative, perhaps even sensational, which is that this is the story of the world's biggest drug deal. When you think of drug deals, you think of the Colombians and the Mexicans, and you think of movies and TV series which are made on the subject. There have been recent writings which also, for example, taking the case of the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, describing them as the world's first multinationals.
Yeah.
It's about a lot of things, but it is about opium, it is about colonialism, it is about empire. But the story really begins with tea. And, I have yet to read something on, I know that the British took to tea and become obsessed with it in the 19th century. But I have not read anything on why it becomes a national obsession. It's in some ways it's like potato, right? If we didn't have potatoes, we got them. Now, potatoes are everywhere. Not just India, but everywhere. It's not an obsession really, but you just accept it as something which has been there forever.
Yeah.
You know of any writing on why the British become so obsessed with tea and within such a short period? Really?
No, you have pulled a thread that unravels the entire book. This is the kind of question that sets up the entire thing. So the first thing you need to know about tea is that essentially it comes, all tea from everywhere comes from China. There is this lovely kind of detail that in most languages, the word for tea either starts with the ter sound or the ch sound. And basically, if it came to that country by sea, it takes the ter sound. And if it came to that country by land from China, it takes the ch sound. So that the tea and chai, all of it comes from China. And the way tea comes to Britain specifically is also tied to India. In the 17th century, Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese kind of princess, marries the British kind of king. And he in that wedding, the Bombay comes to Britain. The Portuguese give it as a wedding gift. And Catherine of Braganza, she drinks tea in Portugal, but she comes to England, and they don't have this beverage there, and she kind of popularizes it. But the way it goes from being some kind of aristocratic, exotic import in England to a mass cultural and national obsession is actually another thing that I talk about in the book, which is sugar. So tea is drunk with sugar, and it's almost like a vehicle for sugar so that working class people can have sugar, and it becomes we get the tea break as an institution, because when you're in a factory, sugar is just this nice energy boost, and that comes with tea. So, and after a certain point, Britain is importing so much tea that at its peak, 10% of the country's entire revenue comes from import taxes on tea. This is there is if that was true for oil, that country would be called an oil country. It's a very high number. I think the comparison I have in the book is that currently the UK's entire income from taxing corporations is 9%. So the fact that 10% is so central to a country's entire functioning, and they're importing so much tea from China that, and this is where opium comes in, their entire what we call balance of trade or balance of payments is completely skewed. So they are paying silver to China. China will only accept silver, and they are buying tea, and they are literally running out of physical silver. They have no more to give. Their treasury is empty. They are reaching a point at which they will have to buy tea, and they have nothing else to give China. And that's where they strike upon this idea of let's sell them opium, which exists on a minor scale at this point, but they're this is the product that we will push and will sort of solve our tea problem. Yeah.
Thomas, is there yeah. Okay. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thomas, are there sufficient writings on the East India Company's investment, and then the kind of dependence on opium during this period? We have writings on, as I said, colonialism and empire, but does that opium part of it, and you have put that very, very bluntly in your book, that this is something that East India Company officials, the British, were completely aware of the harm that opium was capable of doing. And I also have to wonder, to that extent, if if the Chinese became so opium dependent, did it even touch the British? I mean, opium consumption, did it also reach the British in some ways? And again, is there much writing on the subject, on the East India Company's opium trade, or as also on opium consumption in England at that time?
There is some, I think, that usually touched upon, like even in this book, that isn't the focus of it, but it's usually touched upon in these kind of like broad sweeping, in mass market books, it's usually touched upon in kind of broad sweeping histories of the Opium Wars, which is usually the exciting incident that this thing is, all this information is kind of tangentially attached to. There is academic writing on it, the writing that kind of like I cite in the book specifically. And the thing is that there's this transition in the world really, where opium goes from being a folk remedy, like something that people all across the world potentially like took as medication for like pain and things like that. Like even in Britain, like opium was available in a medicalized form, like on corner stores in whatever passed for a pharmacy, like back then. Like working class people took it to kind of like dull the ache. Like this is like laudanum is a name that kind of we're familiar with, which is an opium-based tincture that people used to kind of take drops of. But there is writing about it, and there is writing about how it gets kind of like medicalized and things like that. But specifically, this idea that the East India Company is, I think at its peak, opium was the third highest source of revenue for the East India Company, or the government of British India. And like we know that the first two highest sources are land and salt. And land is, we have the movie Lagan. Like people know that, like we know about land taxes. We know how exploitative they were. And you have the Dundee March. Like we know about salt. We know that it played a kind of like huge role in the empire's kind of like machine, but we don't know about opium. So this section of it, the like there isn't much writing, at least that is available, non-academic, that is available in bookstores about this East India Company's like opium operation, because that's what it is, right? If your third highest source of revenue is a drug, you are a drug company, right? Like, I mean, this is what I call them a cartel, because and I call them, and when you said that they're like the first multinational or whatever, like we are seeing, what this shows us is that like the birth of companies, the birth of multinational corporate joint stock corporations is tied with like drugs. Like the first multinational company, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The VOC pioneers the drug trade, specifically to their places in Southeast Asia. So there's this idea that with colonialism comes the trade in drugs. We think about spices a lot. We think about that's why they came here, and we know about that. But so with these companies, like from the origin, like drugs are a part of it, and this is, to me, a thing that we definitely don't talk about enough. And like you said, they are aware of this illegality. Like from the first transaction onwards, there is always someone saying that this is immoral. I don't think we can talk about legality. I think that's a concept that has not really taken root yet. But sometimes it's the church, sometimes it's missionaries in China who are complaining that because the British are selling opium there, nobody wants to convert to Christianity. Like this is they equate the white man with opium, and they call Christianity Jesus opium. So it's like a really strange thing. But missionaries are like, you are like, this is more important, right? Like this kind of and they're trying to. So there is constantly this voice back home in Britain, like everywhere around the world. Even though this was widely practiced, there's always voices saying, what, this is wrong. But yeah.
Thomas, opium, of course, predates the British trade in opium. I mean, during the Mughal Empire, even earlier. And you have a chapter on that, and you also have a chapter on opium after, the 20th century. Yeah. But I think it would be interesting for you to tell us a little bit about opium use or opium production in the pre-British period.
Yeah.
Before it becomes, a common drug from which the British East India Company benefited immensely from. So a little bit about opium before the British.
Yeah, in fact, I think what the British really do is they standardize, they monopolize, and they expand, right? Something unorganized exists before them. Even, there are even exports. But I think, even when I started writing about this book and researching and talking to people about it, right, there are people in my people who remember their grandmothers taking small pellets of opium to kind of go to sleep at night, right? Like there is there is a history of this drug before it becomes, what can we say, commercialized, before it becomes a commodity. It exists as a plant, a weed that is kind of like growing there, that people might harvest. And I think specifically with the Mughals, there is this, the thing I discovered kind of like researching for this is how many like Mughal emperors are like either alcoholics or like addicted to like these like substances. I think like Babur, Humayun, Akbar, they're all kind of like associated. There are accounts of them kind of, either drinking so much that they kind of like pass out and, just mixing that with like various drugs, including opium. Jahangir was referred to as an addict. His son, like Shah Jahan, apparently did not drink or do drugs till he was in his 20s, and his father is extremely disappointed with him. And it's like, what is wrong with you? Like, why don't
I like the way you put it. Two drugs. Okay, go on.
That's what they're doing, and it's also used for like practical purposes, right? When these kings wanted to go hunting, some polite functionary would go ahead and like, feed the lion some meat drugged with opium. So they're kind of like passive so that the emperor can come in and score the hunt kind of easily and things like that. Messengers at that point of time were like running from city to city. They would just jog, right? They would go from town to town like that. And they would consume opium as a way of just fending off the pain, keeping discomfort at bay as they kind of jogged for these like 12 hours at a time.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's a very normal thing. And the British kind of just make it explode.
So what you're basically saying in a way is that the commercialization of opium is really a 19th century phenomenon, right? I mean, on that large scale trade, in terms of large scale trade. Now, one chapter in the book is devoted to the competition the British started to face from enterprising Indian traders on the West Coast, who also took to opium production and trade with China. Now, is this another part of the story where, I didn't know about, I knew vaguely that, you had Indian traders, of course, who were also involved, but I didn't know so much about the production and trade with China, directly trading with China. And then the British sort of learned to live with that. In fact, what the chapter tells us is that the British started to buy their opium from these guys.
Yeah.
Is this another part of the story on which we need to know more?
Yeah, I think my primary source is Faruqi's book Smuggling as Subversion. Like he has done a lot of like primary work citing government documents and things like that that explore like this part of it. Essentially, what happens is in the beginning of the 19th century. So commercial trade has been going on for some time. It starts at the second half of the 18th century in a big way. But in the beginning of the 19th century, the East India Company is sitting in Calcutta and they receive news that like Indian opium is coming into China, but it's not from them. And they're like, they have instituted a unidirectional monopoly and they're quite upset at this. And they find out that in the western side of India, in the Malwa Plateau, as it's called, the Maratha Confederacy, like they are growing opium at a large scale and they are exporting it with the help of the Portuguese, usually, maybe from Portuguese controlled ports in Daman and places like that. But and these like this trade, unlike what's happening in Bengal and Bihar, is not controlled by the company. It's decentralized. It is it's not controlled by kings either, but usually like local governors and things like that, zamindars, like they are kind of promoting this. There are capitalists, there are shipping, like there's this whole industry kind of like building here of native Indian merchants, taking up this product because they see it has like commercial like value. And essentially the British, at various points they try to stop it out. They try to engage in, they fight the Anglo-Maratha wars. They go into indirect rule of these like princely states. They try to negotiate treaties with them where they're like, we will buy all your opium. And these kings are quite clever. So they say, yes, you'll buy, we'll sell it to you. Sure, we'll sell you all our opium. And they quote a number which is double the production that they have. So they essentially double their production and then sell that to the British.
Yeah.
And things like that. So, and finally, I think around 1830, I think the British gave up on this idea that they can control this, that they can stop the smuggling, because anytime they close a port or negotiate a treaty to keep this monopoly, like traders find a way. They start going to Karachi. They start, they circumvent them somehow. So eventually they give up and they say, if you come to Bombay, here's a small fee and you can legally export it from here. Of course, it's technically illegal in China, so there is no way to legally kind of bring it in there. But this is the kind of compromise that the British make when they realize they can't control it.
Thomas, another chapter. I know I'm emphasizing the India part of it because one knows that the Chinese got hooked onto opium, that the British were delivering it to them. But this is sort of connecting to the previous question on the traders on the West Coast. But you also have a chapter on how the opium trade benefits traders in Bombay specifically. Initially Parsis, and then you note that by a Baghdadi Jewish family, the Sassoons. Very, very interesting. Now, some of this wealth was later used to build the JJ Hospital and JJ School of Arts. But, when you tell the story, I was reminded of the fact that several universities in North America and elsewhere have been built from the wealth generated from slave trade and so on and so forth. In fact, my alma mater, James McGill, was a slave trader. So there you go. But there are other numerous examples of countries where all this drug money or money from loot, plunder, etc., from slavery is pumped into things which are now seen as good outcomes. For somebody who writes in the area of politics. Mostly, it's about how you can do something with completely evil intentions, and 200 years down the line, it has been converted into something positive, right? But the question is this: in the 19th century, once India's freedom movement begins, with the birth of the Congress, or even earlier, around that time, you mentioned that the Indian nationalists were reluctant to take up
Yeah.
the opium issue.
Yeah.
Now, what did they think about it, and why were they so reluctant to take it up? I mean, it's not something that they were doing. Is it because of their ties with business groups who were invested in opium? Is it because opium was not affecting us so much as it was the Chinese? Why do you think that was? I mean, what did you find out during the course of writing your book?
Yeah, that's like, to me, that is a really like good question, and you have struck on like many of the reasons actually. Like, one is that the when we talk about Bombay, which is a city central to Indian politics at that time, like Bombay's birth is with this mercantile class, right? It is a city sort of that exists to as a home for mercantilism. So, and there's so much of it that owes its kind of origins to opium and cotton and various other kind of colonial projects. And the nationalists specifically, many of them were from these like mercantile classes themselves. There is that aspect of it as well. But and it's further complicated because the fact they were so anti-alcohol, right? Like, I think these temperance, anti-alcohol agitations were the Trojan horse through which they smuggled in nationalism. Actually, they started protesting anti-alcohol policies because the British were looked more kindly on those. They were like, this is something that people protest in England, so it is perfectly legitimate for you to protest about this here. This is considered a moral kind of protest where nationalism was not, right? That was seditious. So, so the fact that many of these nationalists were so visibly anti-alcohol and were using it as this kind of political wedge to fight like British government, they say nothing about opium, or rather, and the interesting thing is like when they do say something about opium, like it is almost always they are for it. They are very explicitly saying the opium trade cannot end, and the reason they're doing this is simply because it is a trade that brings revenue to India. And they're thinking about, when they start thinking about independence, they're like, why will we give up this source of revenue for us? And there's a lot of like nationalist economics. Gopal Krishna Gokhale like talks a lot about how like the opium trade is, because the profits are going to Britain, is like an invisible tax on India and things like that. So there's a lot of like sentiment. There's an 1889 editorial in the Hindu which says like opium is maybe a great evil, but national bankruptcy is a greater evil. Like this is the logic, And the simple idea is that simply because the people who are suffering are primarily in another country, right? Like it's happening in China. In India, the problem is not widespread. There are like addiction is a minor issue. Like it is an issue, but it is relatively for the Congress like a minor one and not useful politically. But at the same time, they don't speak out for it either. They kind of just keep silent on the issue because many of their British allies, right, the MPs in Britain who might support them in an independent struggle, many of them are anti-opium because the same reason they would support Indian independence, they also support Chinese self-determination, like in this aspect, right? So I think the Congress, their first kind of resolution against opium is in 1924, which is when the League of Nations is discussing it as a kind of like, oh, let's come up with an international resolution on the matter. Like that is extremely late, and there's a kind of local like opium epidemic in Assam, and like these are the instances, these are the issues that this late in the game is when they kind of like take it up, but otherwise they are just silent on it because that is what is best for them. And I found that really, really strange. Like eventually when the trade kind of ends, nothing to do with them, to China specifically. Like Gokhale says, he kind of confesses, I always felt a sense of deep humiliation at the idea that we were like profiting off this. I'm glad someone else kind of like ended this. He couldn't kind of speak up, but it's it just goes to show, even though a lot of like moral language was used at that time, like Gandhi specifically is like alcohol for him is like a moral issue, right? It's about like spiritualism. It's about, how good are we as people, and the idea that he doesn't talk about this is just shows that, that how that this was not kind of, there's a certain sense of hypocrisy there, but yeah.
With recent developments in Afghanistan, of course, opium again, will become a bigger story. So in that sense, the book is good timing. At least, it goes back to 200 years ago and says, well, no, this is what the British were doing then, and this is what for those who like to know what is now going to happen with the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan. Opium trade was a big part of the story, big part of, again, revenue for the Taliban. And that's something which is going to really take off once again, likely to take off, certainly.
No, I mean, like the current understanding of where heroin is a drug that was first synthesized in European laboratories, like from opium as a anesthetic and things like that, as pain relief, and is now considered like one of the most serious addictive substances like in the world. And I think the estimates are that 93% of heroin comes, the 93% of the opium produced for heroin comes from Afghanistan. And the idea is that the CIA has a horrible track record with regard to drug economies, but specifically here, like what happened is in the 1980s, when the Soviet-Afghan war was going on, and the CIA and America and the CIA were sort of like funding the Mujahideen as a resistance or whatever. Like when they stopped funding them, these same military groups like had to find another source of money, like another source of revenue, and they basically connected themselves into existing global drug smuggling networks. Right, they organized crime became that source, that replacement. So the CIA may not be directly responsible, but there is this kind of, they created the void, right? They created the group, and now the group has to survive. So what do? They force farmers into growing poppy for them.
Going back to your book, Thomas, what do you see as the larger impact of the opium trade on India? In terms of, you mentioned that the nationalist movement, the leaders took it up only in the 1920s, and that's quite late, when all that is wrong with consumption of opium, etc., is widely known. The ill effects on one's health, one's economy, everything, just about everything. So my question really is this: if we have to look back at these years, 100, 120, 30 odd years from the 19th century to the 1920s, if you had to assess, the impact of this opium trade for India, I mean, of course, I mean, you quote Tanchung in the book and say that, tea for the British, opium for the Chinese, and colonialism for India. I think something like that. So could you spend a few minutes talking about this, the larger impact?
See, the obviously, like, measuring impact is like a very tricky thing. Negatively, when we talk about it, there is some work showing that districts which were primarily valuable to the British as opium producing districts, those are still, like, even today, those lag behind in various socioeconomic indicators because the British did not invest in any kind of like infrastructure in those districts. They just saw them as resources to exploit. So there is, you can argue that some of the poverty in Bihar can trace its roots back to when the British did it as a farm, right, and did not invest in like health or schooling, education, or anything like that, irrigation. And secondly, I think like there is this sense of these institutions that you mentioned. The JJ School of Arts is like central to like India's like art world. M.F. Hussain and the progressive like movement like comes from there. Specifically, like there are these. So South Bombay is considered like this this amazing kind of neighborhood, and a lot of that like value comes from the people who invested in it, right? Sassoon Docks was built by David Sassoon's kind of son. There's the Sassoon Library; it's just there. The JJ Hospital, of course, but like also like various like waterworks, tanks, roads, like all of these. Even in Pune, like places like a lot of these, like this infrastructure was created by merchants who were looking to kind of parlay their wealth into social standing with the British. Like a lot of them were, just saw this philanthropy as a way to give back. I'm sure there was some sense of like community kind of investment or whatever, but the other side is this like winning the respect of the British, right? Being seen as like a philanthropist had this cachet. And so like there's so much of the underlying infrastructure of these places that comes from this trade. And it would be really interesting to kind of talk about that more, because I don't think people like walking those streets like think of these things. And there's a reason why, right? Just because we weren't the ones suffering and we were the ones profiting from it.
Thomas, last question, really, and then let me see if you have some questions. The book is yet to be released, so as I mentioned right at the beginning, I'm one of the few people who has read the book. The book is due to be published by HarperCollins in about a month's time, maybe less. And is it a hardcover edition initially, or a paperback?
Yeah, and it's coming out in 10 days. It's out on the 31st.
It's coming out in 10 days. Oh, fantastic. So it's available for pre-order on Amazon.in and other places. But I think it's a book. I have read parts of it. I've read some chapters. The ones I found, I needed to read absolutely for having any sensible discussion with you. Which part of the book did you most enjoy writing?
So this book was written in 2020, like last year, where travel was impossible, right? Like all my plans for like primary research were like scuttled. So I think, but there is still almost an entire chapter of the book that is like devoted to just like 7 documents.
So there's an upside. So there's an upside of COVID, right? In your case, you finished the book.
No. In the sense that I like, there was this joke about, oh, you're all in lockdown, why don't you write a book? Like, I guess I did, but yeah, so there's this one chapter where I write about the Royal Commission on Opium. So this was the anti-opiumists in the UK are kind of pushing for the trade to stop, right? They're primarily thinking about China, and they're like, they want this kind of immoral trade to end. So they push for this commission, and so the commission's reports, it's thousands of pages. Like it's available like online, and I spent a lot of time kind of like going through it. And the sort of stories that come out. Do you think I could like read a paragraph? Would that be okay?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So I write, the Royal Commission was a titanic process. After a week of interviews in London, they traveled to India, where they spent more than 3 months. They began in Calcutta, the beating heart of the entire debate. From there, they visited British-controlled Burma, Patna, Benares, Lucknow, Lahore, Delhi, Agra, Jaipur, Ajmer, Ahmedabad, Indore, and finally Bombay. They saw more than 700 witnesses. It was a parade of weary government servants, crisply dressed army officers, spirited missionaries, bespectacled physicians, nervous zamindars, exuberant merchants, and eager lawyers. There were hakims and vaidyas, journalists and editors, and even the odd schoolmaster. The commission even deigned to speak to an actual farmer on 1 or 2 occasions. And they even swapped pleasantries with a group of Chinese men in Calcutta for approximately 10 minutes. It was an exercise in opposites, simultaneously thorough and expensive, as well as ludicrously short-sighted and superficial. So, like, to me, this project, right, this commission, and these kind of reports and the testimonies of the 700 witnesses that is available was just a real delight to kind of like get into. My favorite incident is that in Calcutta there are these two members of the Brahmo Samaj, Dwarkanath Ganguly and K.K. Mitra. So what they do is on one of the commission's kind of off days, they take them into Calcutta and they take them off the corner of College Street or whatever. They go and they say, this place is an opium den, and they take them in there and they show them that there's a kind of an illicit sort of like den there with like a brothel next to it. And, you know, there's these sort of like stories of were like really kind of like enjoyable, and I'm glad that they got into the book, because I'm not sure actually whether like anybody has like put them down to paper, right? Like these specific like incidents at least. And so this report was a genuine joy to kind of engage with, and I think is the chapter I'm proudest of, and I think people will kind of really enjoy it. Yeah.
Thomas, we have a question from Binu Varghese, and it is not about this book, but asking how the topic of this book, or whether the topic of this book is going to influence the writing of your second book.
This book is whatever I wanted to do in this area to some extent, though it has given me lots of like ideas. Like I would love to like explore various like tangents to this, like even the anti-alcohol agitations. Like I think they're really like exciting. So there are various things, but I'm not sure. I think my next book, if I kind of get into it, will be in the history of science. Like I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in pre-colonial like Indian science, as well as kind of like how colonialism impacted it and how it kind of continues today. So that's the area I'm potentially kind of exploring in the next one. But thank you, Vinu.
Let me see if there are any other questions, and we are about 40 minutes into the discussion, so we could even sort of end here. But yeah. Just to remind everyone that Opium Inc., Thomas Abraham's first book, is due to be published by HarperCollins, and it'll be out in print in about 10 days and available for pre-order at different outlets, including Amazon.in. Unlike everyone who is listening in, I have been fortunate enough to start reading the book. You'll have to wait for another 10 days or so. Okay, so Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone who tuned in for this book discussion on Opium Inc. by Thomas Abraham. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, yeah, thank you.